Today, we're going to take you through some of the steps that we use to build a river table. We're going to be talking about the pour, building the form, and the processing after the table comes out of the form, including edge details and finishing. First, we start by debarking the slab and removing any loose material or bark inclusions such as this one. It's important to remove the bark because we want the epoxy to adhere to the wood and not to the bark. We often use a chisel and a pick to remove any of these bark inclusions, and for the edges we'll use a draw knife. The draw knife you can order on Amazon. They're normally about $60 and they save a lot of time during the debarking process. Now, you don't need to get every little piece removed, but we try to get to about 80 or 90% to allow the raw wood to be exposed so that when we pour the epoxy, we're attaching directly to the wood. Once you've removed the bark and cleaned up the edges, you can use a wire brush to give a better surface for the epoxy to bond to. On a standard dining table, the debarking process normally takes a couple of hours to do it properly. Once all the bark is removed and you're happy with your slabs, it's time to start building a form. We always build our form a couple of inches longer and wider than the finished table size. This allows us to trim the table to size once the epoxy is cured. Now you'll see here we use HDPE blocks before we put our clamping cauls on. The cured epoxy won't stick to the HDPE, so you won't end up with a block stuck to the top of your table that you've got to deal with now when the epoxy cures. If you don't have HDPE blocks on hand, you can also use blocks covered in sheathing tape. Next up, we're going to add some pigment. For this table, we used EcoPoxy's black liquid pigment. Now, it doesn't take a lot of pigment to get a nice opaque black look. We probably used a little more than we needed to here, but better to be on the safe side than have a translucent or see-through pour when the epoxy cures. It's important to thoroughly mix your epoxy. We use a paddle mixer here that you can buy on Amazon. We typically mix the pigments for at least 5 minutes to make sure they're thoroughly mixed. Next up, the epoxy with the pigment mixed in goes into a degassing chamber. This step helps with removing any micro bubbles from the epoxy. The degassing process normally takes about 5 minutes per bucket, and this will eliminate little micro bubbles from curing in the epoxy, which will lead to challenges when you go to sand and oil the piece. Once the bucket comes out of the degassing chamber, we will take a heat gun and just get rid of those surface bubbles to make sure we're happy with the final color and make sure all the bubbles are out of the epoxy before we do our actual pour. You can also use a blow dryer or a torch for this step. It's not a matter of getting a certain temperature, it's more so just applying some heat to the bubbles, which will make them rise to the top and pop. Now that our epoxy is ready, it's time to pour. If you are wondering how we calculate how much epoxy we need, it's a simple volume calculation. Using inches, we multiply the length by the average width by the depth of the river, and then divide that number by 61 to get the total number of liters needed. For this pour, we're using EcoPoxy FlowCast, which is designed for their deeper pours, and that's available on our website, jeffmacksupply.com, where we also have the calculator to calculate how much epoxy you might need. When calculating how much epoxy we need, we will normally add about 10% to accommodate for epoxy seeping under the slabs and absorbing into the wood. It's not too critical if you overfill your pour. You can simply use a popsicle stick or a scrap piece of wood to push the epoxy back into the void if you need to. Typically, we'll throw our tabletops onto a CNC and remove any excess epoxy after it's all done. The EcoPoxy FlowCast takes 3 days to cure, and after it's cured, we remove our clamping cauls and remove all the HDPE blocks. Then remove our sidewalls. Typically we put screws on every 8 to 10 inches to make sure that we don't have any leaks. You'll notice when the sidewall comes off that there's lots of silicone in there, and we typically try to use more silicone than what we think we need to eliminate the chance of any leaks. After the table comes out of the form, we send it over to the CNC, where the CNC will flatten the wood and epoxy to the exact same thickness. We're using a CanCam CNC, and we've got our bits from Tools Today. If you don't have a CNC, you can build yourself a router sled. There's lots of DIY plans out there. Or you could take it to your local shop and have them flatten it for you. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the shop to film any of the sanding steps on this one, but we normally start at 60 grit and work our way through to 220 grit before we put the 1/4 inch round over on our table. Since we primarily make dining tables, we keep a 1/4 inch round over bit in a cordless router all the time, just so we can grab it off the shelf and get to routing. After adding the edge detail and we are happy with the round over, we will give it one last sand at 220 before it's time to oil. Now we use Rubio Monocoat, which is a commercial grade oil finish. It was originally designed for flooring, but in the last 8 to 10 years, it's been used on furniture. It's 0 VOCs, food safe, so you can safely put this on any surface that's going to have food on it and not have to worry about it. There's a couple different ways of applying this oil. Here you can see us using a squeegee to spread the oil around and make sure all the surfaces are covered. You can also use a white pad on a orbital sander or a buffer to work the oil into the piece, which you've probably seen us do in other videos. Both are great methods. For smaller tables, we normally just spread it with a squeegee because we don't want to throw the big white pad in the garbage every single time we do a small project. We get a lot of questions about only sanding our tables up to 180 or 220 because a lot of people think it's not smooth enough, but for the Rubio Monocoat to work, you can't sand much higher than that or else the oil won't penetrate and protect. We always oil the underside of the table first, and then we will flip the top over to complete the top surface as well as the edges. When applying oil to the edges, we just take one of our 6 by 9 inch white pads and apply a little bit of oil to rub on the edges and work it into the end grain. The Rubio Monocoat Pure is our go-to for all of our wood and epoxy tables. It just finishes up the grain nicely and makes the epoxy look great. Once all surfaces of the table are covered with the oil, we wipe off all excess oil. It's important to wipe all the excess oil off until no oil is coming up on your shop towels. We like to wait 24 hours before handling the table to eliminate any fingerprints. Let us know if you have any questions down in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this.